Protests in the United States have inspired anti-racism marches around the globe as demonstrators turn to racial injustice in their own communities. Yesterday in Britain, activists were met by counter-protesters. Demonstrations took a violent turn as far-right groups clashed with police. Dominic Velitis is following the story for us today, once again in Bristol, England. Dom, what more do we know?
Yeah, John, some pretty unsavoury scenes in London yesterday. Police found themselves under attack on several fronts, really. We saw disorder in Parliament Square, in Trafalgar Square and at Waterloo Station, just to name 3 locations. And we saw bottles, cans, fireworks, smoke bombs, flares thrown at police lines. But officers were also physically attacked, with kicked and punched. And at the end of the day, around about 100 plus people were arrested during the disorder. Not only that, around 20 people, including 6 police officers, were injured in the disorder. A bit of a complex picture as to who was really responsible for yesterday's disorder, John, because multiple groups were involved here. Multiple groups from across the UK descended on London yesterday, right-wing activists and football hooligans among them. They always said that they came to London to protect statues from anti-racist activists, and it is true that several, including the statue for Sir Winston Churchill, was defaced at last weekend's protest. But what's unclear is, and a little bit confusing, is that most of these statues are actually boarded up as a precaution ahead of yesterday's protest. So it's not really clear what they were actually protecting. Nevertheless, you can imagine reaction has been pretty strong to what happened in London yesterday, John. The violence and disorder has been widely condemned. Boris Johnson has taken to Twitter to vow that those responsible for attacking the police will feel the full force of the law. John.
Protests in Paris also turned violent. Dom, what can you tell us about that?
Yes, right. In fact, there were protests against racism and alleged police brutality in several French cities yesterday, really inspired by America's Black Lives Matter protests. But you're right, Paris was really the focus point, where around 15,000 people took to the streets there. They were allowed to gather in the centre, but they were prevented from marching through the city, which is what they wanted to do, on the grounds that there was a possible threat to local businesses. And that really sparked anger. Fighting broke out. The police then moved in and used tear gas to disperse the crowds. And it was pretty much all over by yesterday evening. But it's worth pointing out here, John, that the French police are really under the spotlight at the moment. They've received something in the region of 1,500 complaints over the last year, half of which are for alleged violence. And the authorities have now promised a crackdown on racism within the police force. And that has prompted a backlash from police unions and officers who deny that racism is a widespread problem. And then on Friday, French police held their own protest in Paris, in which they threw down their handcuffs onto the floor as a symbolic gesture. John.
Thanks for this, Dominic. CBC's Dominic Velitis reporting in Bristol, England.